Good morning. I'm Linda Ferber. I'm the Vice President and Senior Art Historian here at the New York Historical Society, and I can't tell you what a joy it is to welcome you all to what many of you recognize the moment you, even perhaps before you walked in the door, is an institution that has truly been transformed since the last time that you met here in 2006. I'm welcoming you this morning on behalf of our trustees, our president, Louise Mirror, and my colleagues, a number of whom are card-carrying members, including, I'll just mention their names because all of what you see here today is the fruit of their labors with a lot of support from a fabulous staff of museum colleagues. It's Kim Orcutt, Roberta Olson, Margie Hofer, Marilyn Kushner, and Stephen Edidin. I like to say that we look like a three-ring circus, but we're really a one-ring circus. I'm blessed with extraordinary colleagues, and we've been working very hard over the last 7 or 8 years to essentially rehabilitate one of the greatest art collections in the United States. This is the oldest museum in New York, founded in 2004, and one of our major engines for this project of rehabilitation and rediscovery has been a program, this is a plug, called modestly Sharing a National Treasure, the traveling exhibition program of the New York Historical Society. Some of you in the audience today have already been or are about to be partners with us in this voyage of discovery, and it's been a great joy. Not only are we rehabilitating literally a 200-year-old collection through conservation, but also intellectually by inviting scholars to work with us on the projects, and of course by publishing books that I think, indeed know, have been real contributions to the literature, if nothing else, by publishing works that have really been out of the conversation about the history of both American and European art, some of them forever. So I welcome you. I will tell you that by special dispensation this afternoon, the Curators of America will be having their box lunches in the midst of the Birds of America. So it may be a little difficult to study the exhibition, but you'll certainly, I think, enjoy it. Our displays on the first floor and in the Luce Center on the fourth floor are all available to you, and don't hesitate to approach any of us if you have any particular questions. So thank you very much for being here, and enjoy your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to the New York Historical Society for being such gracious hosts this year. I'm Carol Eliel. I am what I'm now saying the outgoing president of the AAMC with a big smile on my face. Not that I have not loved being the president, but it is time to pass on the torch later today. And welcome to everybody. As I'm sure that everyone in the room is keenly aware, our keynote speaker today, Holland Cotter, is co-chief art critic at the New York Times, where he is also a senior writer. He is, what can I say? In 2009, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism, and the following year was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award for Art Writing by the College Art Association. Educated at Harvard, Cotter studied poetry with Robert Lowell. At Hunter College, he received his master's in American modernism, and at Columbia University, he earned an MPhil in South Asian art with a focus on early Indian Buddhist art. A 2012 Poynter Fellow in Journalism at Yale University, and the recipient of the 2012 Religion and the Arts Award from the American Academy of Religion. Cotter just last month was the Alan Leroy Locke Lecturer at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research at Harvard University. In addition, he was for many years a contributing writer to Art in America and an editorial associate of Art News. He lives in New York City with his spouse, Jo Rosh. So it's clear, I think, to all of us from his remarkable achievements that Holland Cotter has broad and deep interests in the arts and related fields. And I have to say, to my mind, He is one of the world's most astute and also eminently readable art critics. We are truly thrilled to have him as our keynote speaker today, and it is an honor and a pleasure to present him to you.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank some people here. Sally Block, Krista Clark, Deborah Cullen, Carol Elio, and Madeline Hayden for inviting me to speak here today. It's a big honor, and I want to welcome you to your jamboree. I've never been in such a curator-intensive environment in my entire life. So it's great. It's a good feeling. I regard the art of curating, and I am happy to call it an art, as a form of materialized thinking, which, if it is serious thinking, and it very often is in my experience, is a very demanding process, one that requires astute mind-eye coordination, deep research and comparative analysis, a bold grasp of the global past and present, a talent for editing, and a willingness, I assume, to revise right up to the deadline. And when I say I value curators, I'm not just being nice. Without you, I'd be pretty much out of business. I could write about art, but only in a haphazard way about what the galleries feed me from month to month, or about occasional arrivals in the permanent collections of museums. But the thinking part, often embodied in temporary museum exhibitions, the synthesizing process that connects visual, cultural, and political dots over continents and centuries, all of that would be missing without you. Let me just say up front that looking back from 30 years or so of seeing museum shows, I can say that in terms of expertise, I feel that curating as a field is at a high point. I also see tremendous strides have been made beginning in the 1980s and 90s, and probably going back before then, but that's when I was most aware of it, in terms of diversifying museum collections and exhibitions. At the same time, I feel that recently, I'm talking within the last 2 seasons actually, in terms of exhibition programming, at least in New York City, the field has been in a cautious and conservative phase. I grew up in American museums in a cautious and conservative era, the 1950s, and in 2 museums in particular, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which is very close by. Being from a museum-going family, I spent a lot of time in both institutions and had very different art experiences in the 2 of them. And they're art experiences I wish that young people today could have, and I hope that they do have. The MFA was an encyclopedic museum, albeit an encyclopedia with some missing volumes. As a quite young kid, I was left pretty much on my own in the museum to wander around on winter weekends to create what amounted to self-curated tours. From the age of about 10 on, I got to know the collection very well: Egyptian art, European Renaissance art, South Asian, early American, and so on. And I was especially drawn to the museum's Japanese galleries. I think because they were set up as total environments, with most of the big temple Buddhas in a kind of simulated walk-in Japanese temple situation. Wonderful atmospheric place to be. I see now that not only was that early exposure to art important, but so was the exposure to all kinds of art, which is the real advantage of the Encyclopedic Museum, the Universal Museum. Right from the start, I got a sense of the existence of many different cultures in the world, and most important, a sense of the equivalence in value of those cultures. I think because of that, no art has ever really felt strange to me, even if it has sometimes been hard to grasp in the short run. The Gardner Museum offered a very different experience because it was famous for being a minutely curated environment, basically a giant art installation. Part of the mythos surrounding it was that Mrs. Gardner not only personally chose all the objects in the museum, which had been her home, but that she had positioned them all just so. To add to that drama of control, she had decreed that nothing could ever be moved without dire consequences. Wow. So once you knew this story, you became very conscious of the power of placement. You began to notice after a few visits exactly what went where. Say that small table over there with the small painting of Christ carrying the cross and the little vase of fresh cut violets in front of it was there every time you went. And you started to wonder why. You assumed that if that arrangement was fixed forever, it must have a logic. So it paid to keep your eyes open for stories that were being suggested, for energies that were being passed back and forth among things. And in an environment created in an environment that creates a condition of suspenseful alertness, objects take on an aura of glamour and mystery. They radiate personality, a mood of expectation. So early on, from the MFA and the Gardner, I learned two lessons. One was about the sheer egalitarian breadth of art as a phenomenon. The other was about how that phenomenon could be focused and personalized, how visuality could be transformed into vision. I'll mention two other art situations. One curated, the other, a curated situation, and the other an actual exhibition. That together, in different ways, shaped my own relationship to art as a writer. In 1966, I entered college as a literature major with a specific interest in poetry. But more or less by accident, the first course I took was an art course. At that time, again, 1966, all freshmen in my school were required to take a science credit. I scoured the listings in search of a doable option, and I finally found one, an anthropology course called Primitive Art. Primitive art in this case meant African, Oceanic, and Native American art, none of which I had ever seen at the MFA, never mind at the Gardner, because they weren't there. In fact, up until 1966, only one doctorate in African art history had ever been granted by a United States university, and that was to Roy Sieber in 1957. 1966, Robert Ferris Thompson got the second one at Yale. The class met not in an art museum, but in a museum of ethnology, which had an old collection of West and Central African masks and sculptures. I had no idea what I was walking into, and I ended up being swept away. As it happened, the graduate student who was leading my section was an aspiring Africanist. He taught the assigned curriculum, kind of a smorgasbord of reading, but spent a lot of the class time showing rough-cut films of masquerades that he had recently filmed in West Africa. We would watch and listen to the films. He had audiotaped everything, too. Then go out into the galleries and track down the masks we had seen being danced. We were, in effect, his test audience. And the films set up our responses to the objects in the museum. So we were essentially participating in a kind of interactive multimedia exhibition. This was a fantastic way to see and understand art. It was the first time I was ever aware of art that did something, that moved, healed, transformed identities, played with gender, made jokes, was alive, not just for passive viewing. This experience made me receptive to the idea that much of the European church art I had been looking at the MFA, and the Buddhist art and the Hindu art, and the Gardner Museum as an environment with all the pieces that were part of it, that all of this was alive in a comparable way. And I would eventually see that many of the Western modern and contemporary art forms that I came to write about years later abstract painting, conceptual art, performance art, process art, installation art, sound art, all existed without those labels in Africa long before they became avant-garde art here. The crucial thing was getting a hit of that principle of vitality at an early point. The idea that art doesn't just exist, it happens. And that I'm somehow part of that happening if I approach art and look at it and think about it in an activist way. After college, I did a lot of non-art related work. Then in the late 1970s and early 1980s in New York, I got into a relationship with an artist, and I ended up living with a bunch of artists and talking with them a lot, and I started writing about art. These things happen by accident. It's amazing, but they do. But almost everybody I know who's an art writer now stumbled into it from some other direction. And I gradually, so I was writing for New York magazines. There were quite a few magazines then, actually print magazines, and I gradually built up a freelance base. My beat at that time was the East Village, which is where I lived, and which at that time was becoming the city's hot art neighborhood. I wrote about new art there solidly for a couple of years, and then I started to slow down. I was finding the stuff I was looking at less and less interesting as the hype grew stronger and the second shows started coming around that weren't all that different from the first shows. I wanted something more complicated from art. I wanted to get back to the art that I'd known as a kid at the MFA and at the Gardner and in college. I wanted art I could live in. In 1983, I saw an exhibition called The Great Age of Japanese Buddhist Sculpture, AD 600 to 1300 at Japan Society here in New York. It had come from the Kimball. And the work, which was almost entirely of wood-carved figures, was so beautiful that I decided I wanted to go where that art had been made. So I bought a plane ticket and flew to Japan and stayed for a while, mostly in the countryside, visiting temples and shrines. I didn't speak Japanese. Very few people I encountered spoke English, so it was an extremely quiet trip. But wonderful. I mean, a really looking trip, you know, very wonderful. But when I got back to New York, I wanted to write about what I'd seen. But I found that I couldn't. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have the language for it. So at that point, all I knew was how much I didn't know about art, basically. And I felt that the Japanese art that I'd experienced and the people who had made it and loved it really deserved my best effort to learn as much as I could. So I went back to school part-time at Hunter at night in the art history program, graduate program. I took almost every course they offered, beginning chronologically with Greek art, then going to Roman art, and so on and so on. Through an Islamic art course, I ended up going to on a special independent study to Kashmir to look at Mughal garden architecture, and that took me then down to India, where I stayed a long time. And that trip to India took me back to stuff I'd looked at when I was a kid at the MFA, which is that very early Buddhist Indian sculpture in the Kumaraswamy collection at the MFA, which I'd loved from when I was a little kid. And then I came back here and decided to study South Asian art, and specifically Buddhist art, as Carol said, and that was at Columbia with Vidya Deheja. And while I was doing all that, I resumed writing about contemporary art. I felt somehow grounded again, maybe for the first time, actually. I felt like, well, I think I can do this. I think I know what I'm doing now. Although I was covering different subjects than the ones I'd covered before. It was a different, I had more confidence. It was when I was in graduate school, incidentally, and that I had my single slight brush, very slight brush, with curating. In the summer of, I think, I think 1990, Asia Society over on Park Avenue was putting out its South Asian and Southeast Asian material from the Rockefeller collection. The John D. Rockefeller collection was going to be rotated in for that summer. The society was hard up for volunteer docents because everybody was on vacation, and asked me if I would volunteer, and I said sure, but with one stipulation, that I could help install the display. What I didn't tell them was that all I was really interested in was getting my hands on some of that sculpture. I was hungry to know what it felt like to lift a chola bronze and to feel its precise weight and to feel the surface of that warm, crumbly-looking Kushan red sandstone. I wanted to just know what that texture felt like. So I just, when they were setting it up, I kind of schlepped stuff across the room and put it there, and I'd done my thing. I did what I wanted to do. I'm not by nature an object person, in fact. I don't collect art. I like it that so much art is in museums under your care. You dust it and take care of it. It's not in my living room. And I've always been drawn to early conceptualism for this reason. I love conceptual art, and I love the idea of ephemerality in art, which is there's a whole range of art from Africa that is based on the concept of going away. And I just adore that art. So I love the idea of it and the look of it, everything. And I do feel, everything basically is vanishing as we sit here, just at very slow rates. So the whole philosophical idea also appeals to me. But this touching of things and carrying of things and feeling of weights was not at all an intellectual experience for me. It was really a neurological experience, visceral experience, which I've never forgotten, and which added to my sense of what I imagined a real curator does and feels and is inspired by. I want to emphasize that I have no specialty in art at all. I'm not and have never been an Asianist or an Africanist or an Americanist. I'm a classic, old-fashioned generalist. I began by covering new art in galleries in New York, almost all of it American or European, and I'm still doing that, but I've added interests to that. And I think being basically an unreconstructed 60s person tends to make me just naturally think globally and inclusively. Plus, I like variety. Temperamentally, I do. It so happened that when I started to write for the Times, which is in 1992, the art world, the contemporary art world, and the larger art world, now that I'm thinking about it, was in a period of cultural expansion and transition. The economy had tanked. The art market was scrambling. The gatekeepers were not sure in what direction to look. So all kinds of new art came piling in. Not only did the art of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans gain admittance, so did art from Africa, Asia, and South America, art that we barely even knew existed at that time. And new institutions arose to show that art. If I had to point to a single museum that influenced me most in terms of curatorial style and thinking, it would be the Museum for African Art in New York in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Simply put, that museum gave me, and I think many other writers, a sense of what a museum could be and could do. I'm sure you know the museum. Susan Vogel started it in the 1980s, and it was in a townhouse on the east side for a while, moved downtown to Soho, moved out to Queens to a loft space out there. At the same time, MoMA moved out to Queens temporarily and has not reopened since. It exists still. It has a potential quarters up at the top of Fifth Avenue, 109th Street and Fifth Avenue. They just haven't been able to move in there yet. It's a financial thing. They still, however, send out shows. The Jane Alexander show that's now at John the Divine, which I highly recommend, it's a wonderful show, is a Museum for African Art show. They organized that show and put it out there, and a bunch of other things. Anyway, and to my mind, that museum's most radical exhibition was Face of the Gods, Art and Altars of Africa and the African Americas, which was organized by Bob Thompson in 1993. Bob, who got the 1966 second dissertation in African art, and he's at Yale. The show was made up of 24 altars from various centers of Afro-Atlantic worship. Some were historical objects in the traditional sense. They were borrowed and sent back after the show was over. Others were commissioned by the museum from ritual practitioners who created and consecrated the altars on site for the show, then ritually dismantled them when the show came down. And finally, there were recreations of untransportable altars, such as sand altars to the sea, to the goddess of the sea that you find on the beaches in Rio de Janeiro. They were reconstructed from photographs by the museum's design team in the form of natural history style dioramas. So you had all these different techniques going at once. So the fine art and versus ethnology divide that defined the museums of my youth was more or less erased in this show. And this erasure, in a world of conventional museums, raises all kinds of aesthetic and ethical questions about authenticity, about sacredness, about the possibility or impossibility of religious worship within a museum context. What really set the show apart, though, was the audience it attracted. People came who had never been to a museum before, and they came because they had heard about live altars. Devotees of Afro-Caribbean Santeria and Afro-Brazilian Candomblé came to the museum and left coins and fruit and offered prayers and sang songs, and nobody interfered with them. For anyone who's been to a temple museum in India or in Japan, this response is familiar. But in a Western museum, it was virtually unheard of, or at least very rare. As early as in 1988, I must say that the Tibetan monks had installed a Kalachakra sand mandala right across the street here at the Natural History Museum in 1988. And that was quite an event. It was the first one in the city. And it attracted a lot of people a lot of religious people came to that. And I'm not a religious person, but I was there. And I got in the line at the end of that Kalachakra, they just after days and days of making this incredibly elaborate, huge sand thing, in colored sand, they take little brooms, they broom it all into a little pile, put it in a jar, and we all walked it down to the river and threw it in for the benefit of marine life. Anyway, it was a wonderful event. And there have been other, and that show also, the Museum for African Art show also inspired other similar shows. There was a wonderful Sufi show, Saint in the City, at the Fowler Museum in California, which also drew a community of people to it, because it was built around a Sufi saint, a Senegalese saint, Amadou Bamba, and his many worshippers. There in 116th Street in New York, you'll find many of his images all came to this exhibition. So these shows drew people into museums that had never been to museums before. It was really wonderful. As I need not tell anyone in this room, however, such attempts to accommodate live art make heavy demands on a museum. But the reality is, I feel, that if you're going to seriously embark on the job of presenting spiritually functional art, non-Western or Western, you are at some point going to run up against fundamental challenges to your keep it behind plexi conventions. At present, interest in or fashion for doing such exhibitions seems to have passed, which I feel is unfortunate in light of the statistics indicating that American museum audiences are overall growing less rather than more ethnically diverse. Surely we should be making every effort to alter that trend. Perhaps ironically, the most recent and by far the most popular exercise in museological devotion was offered by none other than the Museum of Modern Art. When, in 2010, the artist Marina Abramovich sat in MoMA's atrium for 10 weeks, giving darshan to a steady flow of worshipers, albeit worshipers of a very different kind than those who came to Face of the Gods. I'm not a nostalgic person. I don't at all hanker for a return to the past, be it the 1960s or the 1990s. But I am conscious of certain institutional experiments in audience outreach that seem to have been consigned to the past, as if no longer pertinent or of interest. I've just mentioned one of them, that kind of show with live material. Another is the use of non-museum spaces for showing art. I remember, for example, an extraordinary installation called Badge of Honor, curated by Pepona Sorio, a Puerto Rican-born artist, New York artist, in a storefront in a working-class Puerto Rican neighborhood in Newark in 1995. The show was sponsored by the Newark Museum. The piece, which was about a father in prison communicating with his young son, later transferred to the museum and then to a commercial gallery. It had a different resonance in each venue, but it was particularly powerful in its original site, where its subject was a lived subject. It really got people talking in that community about the issues that were being raised and about the fact that art was the vehicle for bringing these issues to them. The 2013 version of such alternative venues are big ticket places like the 7th Regiment Armory in Park Avenue. But that's just not the same thing at all. That's not what I'm talking about. Nor is it the same thing to preserve site-specific work and then bring it back into show later, to revive it, which is at present what's happening at the new museum with Nari Ward's installation Amazing Grace, with its made up of hundreds of beat-up baby carriages and a soundtrack of Mahalia Jackson singing Amazing Grace. It was originally created in a disused firehouse in Harlem in 1993, and it was an extraordinary thing to see, to experience. It was subsequently purchased by a European collector and now is temporarily installed with the, quote, 1993 show at the new museum. The piece is still very, very moving, and I encourage you to see it if you haven't, even installed on a gentrified Bowery. But it's also a reminder that lots of young artists could, with some institutional support and encouragement, be out there doing comparably adventurous things in a city that is still filled with empty, unclaimed, derelict space. Despite the New York-centricness of my remarks today, I'm very interested to know about any such work that's being done elsewhere in this country. Museums are historically classist institutions. By now, that's neither a revelation nor an accusation. It's just how things are. If that reality, which does not seem to be changing, means that a significant population of Americans will never be coming in through the doors, let's take art out to where they are. We were doing that to some degree, but that seems to have stopped. Or if we're still doing it, I'm not aware of it. I'm not getting the emails. In general, the art establishment, from my perspective, has returned to a formalist sensibility. Chelsea is full of well-made objects, many of them paintings. I adore painting, but no more than I do any other art form. And my definition of what constitutes a valid art form, and by extension a valid exhibition format, is broad and growing broader with time. I had big problems with the National Museum of the American Indian, excuse me, when it reopened in the Customs House in Lower Manhattan in the early 1990s. I had known the collection for years in its cramped quarters in Upper Manhattan. I was really looking forward to seeing it back on view to advantage in a new space. and I felt burned to find the objects enmeshed in an environment of display technology, videos, voiceovers, graphics, etc., much of it dealing with Native American identity in the present. I didn't want those peripherals. I just wanted art, the real thing. A few years later, I approached a photography exhibit at the same museum with similar, very strong misgivings. The show was called Spirit Capture. It was about the photographic record of enforced changes to Native American life in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There were very few museum-quality objects in that show. Almost all the photographic prints were new. Some were the size of posters. There was a lot of explanatory text. My first reaction was simply to those factors. Gut reaction, negative. But that didn't last. I started to look at the pictures. I started to read the texts in the order that they were set out. I found that show extremely moving. I let the curator guide me. It was beautifully installed, carefully placed, full of information, and with or without vintage photographs, emphatically visual. I understood what I should have understood from the start. This museum does not want to be an art museum in the conventional sense. It wants to be a cultural museum that includes art. And that is a valid thing to aspire to, and has its own set of rules and its own criteria of values. In truth, there are many features of exhibition display that make other people crazy that I'm just fine with. The great debate over whether to have wall labels or not, and if so, what kind, is for me a non-issue. I happen to like labels because I like information, but I also know how to shut information out if it's intrusive, if I'm not in the mood. I just don't look at it. But I appreciate being given a choice of whether to look or not. I'm not at all opposed to videos and soundtracks, additions, or enhancements to an exhibition, provided they are subject to some curatorial fine-tuning. The subtle, continual soundtrack playing in the Brooklyn Museum's current reinstallation of its Native American galleries, I find has several useful purposes. It creates a sound space that sets the galleries off from the rest of the museum. It slows you down and concentrates your attention. I did not see a lot of people taking cell phone pictures when I was there. I've been there repeatedly. They're looking at the objects. And the soundtrack lingers in the mind and in the memory after you leave, which makes you want to come back and spend more time there, which is why I went back to spend more time there, actually. Part of my ongoing education as an art writer, and believe me, it is ongoing, weekly, is to rethink my own biases. When I first started writing for the Times, I still had one foot in academia, and I was a bit uptight about matters of aesthetic purity and validity, including what could and could not be admitted as art. Luckily for me, I also had one foot outside in the real world, and I was listening to some very smart people. One of those people was Susana Leval, then director of El Museo del Barrio in Manhattan. In the early 1990s, she and I were talking about a group of mid-career Latino artists in the East Village, in East Harlem, whose work had consistently been passed over by the mainstream art world as too political or too kitschy or too Latino. The way you hear people actually now talking about art coming from Africa and Asia. Susana said to me, and I'm going to quote her, "To understand these artists, you have to know that their art isn't just about specific political causes. Many of these artists are grassroots cultural activists, teaching kids for free in the neighborhood workshops, as if it were still the 1960s. Now they're no longer young. They're trying to support families, to fight for housing, to change things on their block, and still make art. It's a different time, but they're living by the tenets they set on earlier. and that's something I have the highest admiration for. Their lives and their art are of a piece. She went on, if you understand that view, you stop talking in terms of aesthetic right and wrong. I was once watching Pepon Osorio, here he is again, constructing one of his glittering installations. This one included a jeweled chandelier, and I kept referring to the fake pearls he was using. He said to me, Susanna, they're not fake pearls. They're not fake anything. They're plastic pearls. For many people, plastic pearls are what they have and what they want. Museums are or should be places where art and life are brought together, I feel. And let me mention one last experience that jolted me into an understanding of that. A visit I made to a museum in Africa a little over a year ago. The National Museum of Mali in Bamako is widely considered to be one of the best art institutions in West Africa. It's in the fastest growing city in one of the poorest countries on the continent. Established under French colonial rule in the 1950s, it was originally conceived as a museum of archaeology and anthropology, though it now organizes the Pan-African Biennial of Contemporary Photography called Bamako Encounters, which brings in an international audience, primarily of curators, dealers, and collectors from Europe and North America. The museum itself is still locally regarded as a colonial import and has trouble attracting a regular audience, though its present director, Samuel Sidibe, is making an effort to do so by incorporating contemporary material into the permanent display. The collection includes antique Malian terracottas and figurative wood sculptures. The terracottas are superb. They're from Djenné in northern Mali. The wood sculptures are variable in quality, but representative of various types. Basically, Africa was farmed out of such wooden sculptures before the time this museum was in a position to collect them. So the finest examples are basically in the West now, and have been for quite a while. But connoisseurship is not the selling point of the collection, or is only an incidental one. Mr. Sidibe understands that what makes the sculpture appealing to local audience is its meaning. How can the museum address this question? What do these sculptures have to do with us? His way of giving an answer at the time of the last photo biennial anyway, which is when I was there, was to install, interspersed among the sculptures, photographic portraits of Bamako citizens taken in the 1960s and 70s by some of the city's leading studio photographers, such as Seydou Keita and Malik Sidibe, who still technically has a studio open in the city. So he put these photographs beside and among the sculptures. The idea seemed to be that the photographs, which would be instantly recognizable to local people as images of stylishly dressed families, friends, and neighbors of an earlier generation, might also suggest that the sculptures they accompanied were also, in some sense, portraits too, images from the past that we might relate to in the same way we were relating to the photographs. All family. A second permanent collection gallery, labeled Textiles of Mali, included carefully preserved fragments of 11th and 12th century Telem fabrics found in cave burials in Dogon country to the north. But mostly the gallery was filled with modern fabrics, some of which included traditional themes, others of which were totally contemporary in design. The display itself had a kind of casual, market-friendly flair, with cloth hanging in banner-like rows overhead and draped over metal barrels. It was as if you were encouraged to touch the material, check out its quality. There were no museum guards. In fact, you could have gone ahead and done that. For anyone accustomed to the sanctified atmosphere of Western art museums and the air of preciousness spun around what's in them, the Bamako display was disorienting. I skimmed the room, checked out some labels, and I registered dates, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and I planned to make my visit brief. Then I found myself looking at one piece of cloth close up, a fine cotton hand weave with intricate linear patterning, like marks, like ripples of water on sand. It was in a shade of indigo, different shades of indigo. It was fabulous. Date, 1988. I had no idea where or if this piece fit into a chronological history of African textiles, but I suddenly knew exactly where it fit into my history. A week earlier, I had seen and admired a very similar example that was sitting half-finished on a weaver's loom in a Fulani village far to the north. Was this museum-worthy material I was looking at? Absolutely. In addition, the striking installation, which was like nothing I'd ever seen, had been designed by Abdoulaye Konate, a contemporary Bamako artist of international stature. I'd actually seen his work in Documenta 12, a few years ago. He creates large textile murals on political subjects from locally spun cotton. And in the same gallery was a tribute to the fashion designer Chris Seydou, who was born in Mali in 1952 and died there of AIDS in 1994. He spent the 70s in Paris, where he worked with Yves Saint Laurent and Paco Rabanne. He then returned to Africa and created a line of couture based strictly on Malian fabrics. Several of his designs set on mannequins were on view. Bamako flair meets Paris flair. Fashion meets sculpture. Now meets then. I spent the afternoon in the galleries, looking forward to the music and dance concert, almost a guaranteed crowd pleaser, that would be presented in the museum that evening. Again, to the Western museum goer, to this Western museum goer, the effect was confusing. But confusion, which I consider a healthy sensation, is what Mr. Sidibé was after. Before his time, he said, Malians saw their museum as, quote, something for white people, foreigners, and stayed away. His job was to get them in the door. Quote, if we do fashion, people will think of the museum as being about now, he says. They'll start thinking of what's in it as theirs. In saying this, he was acknowledging huge, decades-long changes in African society. As rural populations have moved into cities to find work, and cities have become repositories for global, meaning primarily Western, culture. In these circumstances, the probability is strong that certain traditions will fade, that old images will be overwhelmed by new ones. This is a familiar story, and not just in Africa, about the gamble and gain of modernism and modernity. But for Mr. Sidibé, the gamble is always in play. It doesn't have to be either or. He is adamant about preserving the past. He has been a crucial voice in protesting the illegal presence of Genet antiquities in Western collections. How to present the past in a meaningful way in a museum he oversees is the big question, and he's still hard at work on it. Antiquity, which has automatic cachet in the West, isn't necessarily valued in cultures that view evanescence as natural and newness as desirable and empowering. Under the circumstances, if a museum's collection manages to persuasively argue for historical meaning, how much does it matter if all the material fails to pass connoisseurial muster? Sometimes authentic is what works. In my view, our own museums have a lot to learn from this. But newness brings problems of its own, particularly now, in this part of the world. For years, I argued strenuously to have museums introduce new art in the context of old art, to carry the new on the back of the old. Now I feel the necessity of petitioning the opposite, to have old art included with the new, so that the old isn't forgotten. Contemporary art, once a footnote to traditional museum collections and academic programs, has now become a dominant element. It's easy to see why. Contemporary art is available in endless supply. More and more collectors buy it. Those collectors are joining museum boards. Contemporary art offers the prospects of more work, better paying jobs for corporate advisors, auction house experts, dealers, and possibly for curators, though not, alas, for art critics. Scholarship centered on contemporary art has opened up possibilities of new avenues of study undreamed of a generation ago. Photography, film, fashion, collection histories, and so on. The downside, I can repeat some of the concerns I hear from art historians and curators, particularly those who are dealing in non-Western fields. Young scholars of African art these days are focusing on urban material culture rather than on the object-intensive study of disappearing rural traditions. There's very little field work being done in the countryside. Research in South Asian art history used to stop at the 18th and 19th century, which we bemoaned. Now that's where it all starts. And nothing before that is being, or very little before that is being paid attention to. And monuments are crumbling. Chinese art history, which long doggedly clung to connoisseurship as the sine qua non of historical knowledge, is now avidly absorbing Western social and political theory. The attempt to unite traditional and contemporary remains a source of tension in exhibitions and in scholarly research, like an identity crisis unresolved. Some scholars continue to decry present-mindedness. They hear a clock ticking and see only preservative work not being done. Others take a more positive view. African and Asian cultures, they say, volatile and multifarious, are in a state of perpetual transformation in the present, which is always instantaneously also the new past. So while some scholars say we are losing the past, others say we are trying to catch the present as it becomes the past. As for museums, it seems to me they haven't figured out what to do. So at least in our big institutions, we're getting a lot of expertly crafted, bound to please, but in my view, bland shows, accompanied by, if I may say so, generally approving critical consensus, cookie cutter thinking from the critical establishment, including from many young critics, which worries me, because they should be ready to put up a fight. There's a lot of pressure on to get and to maintain gigs. It's intense. Economics surely has something to do with this cautiousness, and that's what I think of it as cautiousness. So no doubt does fashion. We're still cycling out of the 1990s mode of experimentation, and we will or will not eventually cycle back in. It seems to me that a lot of people, critics included, have just been waiting for something called postmodernism to blow over so they could get back to something called modernism, which they at least had the language to talk about, to write about. It's important, you know, the language, your command of language, and if you can keep it versatile. Whatever the cause, the energy, in my view, again, I'm talking about New York and museum exhibitions, the energy has slowed down. I found that big exhibitions in New York this winter in some of the biggest museums, MoMA, the Met, and the Guggenheim, to be real disappointments. I'm not going to name names, but they either, you know, were selling tried and true as news or focusing on very obvious aspects of large subjects rather than go after the subject itself and really get in there and do some original work. Or in one case, they were a show reduced like a global phenomenon as if it were the product of a certain small period of time in Western history, when in fact it wasn't. It's a huge subject. And that institution could have changed history if it had done the show right. It didn't do that. It played by its old playbook and produced a gorgeous conservative artifact, in my opinion. At the same time, there were good things. The MoMA gave us Tokyo 1955 to 1970, a new avant-garde, which despite being jammed into this, what felt like a tiny space, it still delivered a blast of new, tantalizing information that no one knew. No one had seen that stuff for I don't know how long. I knew people who lived in Japan all during that period of time, and they said, where did this come from? We used to go to galleries, and you never saw any of this stuff. So basically this show just threw neatness to the winds and it put a ton of things out there. Bam, deal with it, which I did, and I loved it. I could never, however, be a curator myself. It's way too complicated. You have to be a scholar, a logician, an accountant, a diplomat, a housekeeper, a thinker, a feeler, an enforcer, and a dreamer. And you have to end up sitting there listening to people like me talk about you. But since you are sitting there, let me just urge you, again, to abandon caution in your work. Break rules, break rank, conspire with each other, collaborate with each other. Forget categories, high versus low, modern versus traditional, art versus craft, genuine versus inauthentic. None of these are in fact opposites. Just ask artists about that. Be artists yourself. Don't confine art to the context of art history. Put it in the context of life. Please, I need a reason to get up in the morning. You gave me a reason this morning. And I needed to keep my job interesting. I'm depending on you for that, and you can depend on me. Thank you. We have 5 minutes. If there's anybody who wants to ask a question, I'll be happy to.
I'm also going to ask, we have 2 mics set up. This is being recorded, so if you are going to ask questions, you'll come to these mics on the sides.
I'm right about the 5, right? 5 minutes.
I was interested in the comment you made about feeling as if museums are, they sort of move past this interest in cultural diversity, and that at a point things were more interesting and now they've gotten less interesting. And I'm wondering what you think about the tendency that I see in museums to lay that responsibility on what are often called curators of outreach or curators of advancement, engagement, who are not art historically trained curators, and they're not object-oriented professionals, and they lay that responsibility on those people. What you think of that tendency?
Can you give me an example of a show or a...
there are a number of I'm from Los Angeles, and there's at least one institution in Los Angeles who that has what they call the curator of engagement, I believe, who comes out of the PR press realm, not as a writer, but as a person who drums up press for the institution. And she now has become the person who seems to be responsible for that kind of programming curatorially within the institution. Maybe this is not so common. I've seen it in a number of places, and maybe it isn't something that's...
I'm trying to think of a New York equivalent of this, and I can't come up with one.
So maybe, I don't know if anybody here from a New York or an East Coast institution has some comparable. Maybe it's less common than I think.
One thing that occurs to me just off the bat is, originally the people who, this is not true across the board, but in many cases, the people who were the original advocates for non-Western art in museums didn't come from academia. In fact, they came from the education departments of museums. I'm thinking of Vishaka Desai at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where she just basically had to make up that role for herself, and then eventually was appointed curator. And I'm sure she's not the only one who's had to come up with kind of a back stairs to get to this, to get to deal with this material that basically no one else at the museum either wanted to deal with or was equipped to deal with. But somebody had to do it. And she had the enthusiasm and the knowledge and all of that. So I don't know whether that's the same thing as what you're talking about. Don't know.
I don't know either.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, question. Sorry.
Whether they go to school or not, if they're reading hard and they're looking hard and they're talking to people, they may be doing a very good job. It's quite possible. Yeah. It's all, yeah, I think it's one over there. Yeah, I'll hear you, okay.
No, I think there's a similar issue with, you have people from. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Julie. I'm also from LACMA. I think you have a similar issue going on where you have different departments within the same institution working on contemporary art. Or like, I thought it was very interesting how you mentioned that, or you sort of made a call to start bringing historical material into the contemporary context, and that often it's been the other way around. And as someone who's very interested in how those like boundaries can be fluid or less fluid, I'm kind of curious to know what do you think, what strategies would you suggest for different specialists are coming together with different trainings? Some have PhDs, some don't. Some have Sanskrit, some don't, and maybe they're working on trying to get together something like contemporary South Asian art with traditional South Asian art. Mm-hmm. You know, because I think it's important to rise to those challenges, but it is often, there are other issues that come into play, and so I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions.
I don't have a suggestion so much as a model. There's a show now of a contemporary Cambodian artist at the Metropolitan Museum. You've probably seen the show. You know, yeah. And that was a collaboration between John Guy and Sheena Wagstaff, the contemporary, and the South Asian person, and a very amicable one, and a real sharing of information. They're both interested without having intense knowledge of what the others has intense knowledge of, and we're willing to collaborate on that sort of thing. What everybody's really waiting for now, or I'm waiting for anyway, is to see what the Met is going to do with the Whitney space. That's going to be the test case, in my opinion, for this whole thing you're talking about. Whether they're going to, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I'm really, looking forward to that.
I had one more question.
Yeah.
I was curious if you have a sense of, with regard to your discussions of connoisseurship and the level of quality and authenticity of objects, I was wondering if you could comment on how that affects conservation of objects and the extent to which you feel the condition of objects in museums needs to be obviously we want objects to be safe and presented beautifully, but that notion of pristine quality and perfection that we do strive, particularly in a paintings field. If you have experience where sometimes there's a broader range of the condition of an object that is presented in the context of exhibitions or permanent collection displays, because often there's such an extraordinary need to keep up with the conservation of objects. It's often difficult for museums and can prevent the kinds of objects that we want to show from being shown because of condition. I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I'm for conservation. I think it's a good idea. Mm-hmm. I definitely am. I'm not joking. It's good. But I'm also very aware of. I also don't. I was going to say, I don't like the word fetishize, but that's the word I'm going for. I don't think it's like the absolute end of things. I think there's a lot of art that's being made to go away and to be here for a short time. And I saw that, I've seen that traveling. You see that in China, the Buddhist art in China and elsewhere. And that's meant to disintegrate and vanish, and I think it's okay that it does that. In the West, we have this idea that we should keep everything forever and ever and ever. And we can't, basically. We can do our best, But, yeah. It's an interesting idea. It's an interesting philosophical idea, yeah. Do we get a break? Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
One more question.
Yeah.
Thanks for that inspiring talk, Holland. I was interested in your comments about new ways of creating exhibitions and thinking about my colleagues here, not all of whom I know, but I know a lot of them, and I know that there's an enormous amount of creativity in this room. But we also don't work on our own, and I wonder whether you've had the opportunity to present your views to the group of museum directors as well.
I'm just waiting for the invitation. I'd be more than happy to do that very thing. Yeah, so if you've got any pull, just, yeah, I'm available. There's lots to think about. I think our time is up. Okay.